September 19th, 1777. The Hudson River Valley, upstate New York. The morning mist had not yet lifted from the surface of the river. It hung in long, gray threads above the water, drifting between the hills and through the tall timber of the northern wilderness like the slow breath of a sleeping giant. The leaves had begun to turn, amber and crimson streaking through the canopy of hardwood forest, and there was a bite in the air that carried the first suggestion of a coming autumn cold. Somewhere beneath those trees, along the ridge of a place that would one day carry the name Bemis Heights into every history book ever printed in the English language, nearly 7,000 professional soldiers of the British Crown were advancing southward. They marched in ordered columns. Their scarlet coats, freshly brushed for the occasion, as was the custom of the age, moved through the tree line in precise geometric formation, the way armies of Europe had been moving for a century and a half. Their belt buckles gleamed, their polished brass buttons caught the thin September light. Their brown bess muskets were shouldered at a uniform angle, and the sound of their boots striking the forest floor, methodical, rhythmic, utterly certain, carried through the trees like the ticking of a great mechanical clock. It was the sound of empire, the sound of inevitability. At the head of that column, in a magnificent uniform adorned with gold lace and polished epaulettes, rode General John Burgoyne, a man born into the aristocratic traditions of Georgian England, a member of Parliament, a playwright of mild celebrity, and a military commander of absolute self-confidence. He had appeared before the king himself with a bold strategic vision, a three-pronged invasion from Canada intended to sever the rebellious colonies along the natural corridor of the Hudson River, to split New England from the south and end this upstart revolution before winter made travel impossible. He had been granted command of the finest army Britain could assemble for the purpose, regulars trained in European warfare, officers schooled in the academies of the Old World, German auxiliaries hired from the states of Brunswick and Hesse-Hanau, and a complement of indigenous allies to range the wilderness flanks. Burgoyne was not a cautious man. He was a man who believed, with the deep, this unquestioned belief of someone who has never once been truly surprised by the world, that he was simply better. His army was better. His civilization was better. And the ragged, poorly supplied, ideologically confused collection of farmers, trappers, and colonial malcontents who called themselves the Continental Army were simply obstacles. They would scatter as they had scattered before. They would melt back into the wilderness from which they came, and the rebellion would collapse as all provincial vanities eventually collapse, under the weight of professional force. He had, in June of 1777, published a proclamation to the people of the colonies, warning them, in the majestic and somewhat theatrical language that was his natural register, that resistance would be met with devastation. And he had called upon loyal subjects to rally to his banner and denounced the patriots as willful outcasts. He had set out from Canada in the warm flush of summer with 10,000 men, 138 artillery pieces, and a baggage train that contemporaries noted was staggeringly large, including, reportedly, his personal wardrobe, his wine, his silver service, and the personal accoutrements of a man who expected to arrive in Albany as a conqueror. But what he did not fully understand, what no amount of European military training could have prepared him to understand, was that the land ahead of him was not Belgium. It was not the Rhine Valley or the plains of Flanders. It was America. And America, in the late summer of 1777, had produced something the world had never quite seen before. To understand what happened in the wooded ridgelines above the Hudson River during those September and October days, you have to understand what the British Empire was and what it believed itself to be in that year of 1777. Britain had emerged from the 7 Years' War, concluded just 14 years earlier, as the undisputed master of the Western world. It had humiliated France. It had driven the Spanish from contested territories. It had absorbed vast portions of North America, India, and the Caribbean into an imperial network so expansive that the sun, famously, never fully set upon it. Yet the British Army was not merely a fighting force. It was the physical expression of an entire civilization's confidence in its own superiority. Its regiments carried battle honors from Minden, from Quebec, from Plassey. Its officers had studied Frederick the Great and Marlborough. Its infantrymen had been trained to fire 3 aimed volleys per minute in a line of massed formation, a technique that had shattered French columns from the Rhineland to the Bengal coast. When word had reached London that the colonies were in open rebellion, the initial response was one of almost bored contempt. Lord North's government spoke of the colonists as wayward children. Military men described the Continental Army as an armed mob. One British officer, writing home before the campaign began, dismissed the possibility of a serious engagement with American forces by noting that a single season's campaigning would be sufficient to bring the whole affair to a close. Yet the language of British military correspondence from that period is saturated with this dismissiveness. Not malice exactly, but something more corrosive. The absolute, structural inability to imagine that the people they were fighting could possibly be their equals. Burgoyne shared this view, and shared it with the untroubled certainty of a man for whom history had always confirmed his assumptions. And he had watched the rebels retreat from Fort Ticonderoga when he approached with his powerful artillery train in early July. The fort had fallen without a shot. To his mind, this was the pattern: approach, overawe, dissolve. The colonials would not stand. They could not stand. But something had been happening in the forests of New York that Burgoyne could not see from his headquarters and could not foresee from the vantage point of his European strategic education. Yet the American commander at Saratoga was General Horatio Gates, a former British officer who had served in the French and Indian War and understood, from long experience, both how British armies fought and how North American terrain could neutralize the advantages those armies depended upon. Gates had positioned his force on Bemis Heights, a commanding ridge of high ground overlooking the Hudson River, yet fortified by the Polish engineer Thaddeus Kosciuszko in a configuration that denied Burgoyne the ability to move south without either scaling the fortified heights or veering far enough inland into the dense forest to lose cohesion. Gates had, by September of 1777, assembled a force of roughly 11,000 men, a number that would continue to swell as militia flooded in from New England and the surrounding countryside. Farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, hunters, men who had heard the word Burgoyne spoken in their kitchens over the summer and had picked up rifles and walked to the sound of the drums. Among those men was a force that would become the single most decisive tactical instrument of the entire Saratoga campaign. Colonel Daniel Morgan's Corps of Rangers, approximately 500 frontiersmen drawn from Virginia and the western settlements of Pennsylvania, were unlike anything in the British Army's experience. Yes, they were not soldiers in the European sense. They had not been drilled on parade grounds. They did not march in close order formation. They were hunters and scouts who had spent their lives in the American backcountry, moving through heavy forest with a silence and a natural spatial intelligence that no European-trained soldier could replicate. And they were armed with the Pennsylvania long rifle, a weapon that was, in purely technical terms, one of the most remarkable military instruments of the 18th century. The British Brown Bess musket, the standard infantry weapon of the redcoat, was an accurate weapon to perhaps 60 yards in trained hands. It was designed to deliver massed volleys in coordinated lines, not aimed precision fire. The Pennsylvania long rifle, by contrast, was accurate to 300 yards or more, with a spirally grooved barrel that imparted spin to the ball and dramatically improved its flight stability. A man who had grown up hunting deer and elk in the Virginia mountains could, with a Pennsylvania rifle, strike a target at a range that made the target believe himself to be standing far beyond the danger zone. Morgan's men were not merely soldiers. They were men who thought in terms of individual, deliberate shots, men for whom accuracy was a life skill, not a military drill. Yet when Burgoyne's army emerged from the tree line at a place called Freeman's Farm on the morning of September 19th, 1777, they stepped into a world that had ceased to obey the rules they had spent their careers learning. The fighting began in the early hours of the morning, when 3 British columns advanced through the mixed woodland south of Saratoga. Burgoyne intended to overwhelm the American left and break through to the river road. But Morgan's riflemen, fanned out through the forest on the American right, made contact with the British advance and immediately began doing something unprecedented. They began killing officers. This was not a tactic found in any European military manual. In the European tradition, officers were gentlemen, and there existed an informal code, honored more in theory than in practice perhaps, but honored nonetheless, that officers were not specifically targeted by enemy fire. Yet Morgan's men did not operate by that code. They did not operate by any code that had been written in the courts and parliaments of the Old World. They were men of the American frontier, and they fought the way the frontier demanded, by removing the intelligence and direction from the opposing force as rapidly and efficiently as possible. Within the first hours of Freeman's Farm, British officers began dying at a rate that paralyzed command. Captains who stepped forward to direct their companies were struck down before they could issue orders. A lieutenant colonel attempting to reorganize a broken section of line was shot from his horse at a range that seemed impossible to the men standing beside him. The British formations, trained to respond to orders shouted and signaled by their officers, faltered and broke apart when those officers vanished. Small units became isolated. The woodland, which offered no clear sight lines and denied the possibility of the massed volley tactics that had won every European engagement in living memory, became a place of systematic, relentless attrition. The Battle of Freeman's Farm lasted the better part of a day. When it ended, Burgoyne held the ground, technically by the accounting of European engagement, a British victory, but he had lost close to 600 men to the Americans' 300. His offensive momentum had been halted, yet his confidence in a swift advance to Albany had been replaced by something he was not accustomed to feeling: caution. He stopped. He waited. He sent dispatches south, requesting support from General Howe, whose army was, according to the original 3-pronged plan, supposed to move northward up the Hudson to meet him. The response that came back revealed the catastrophic structural failure of the British strategic vision. General Howe had gone to Philadelphia. He had taken his army south to capture the colonial capital, apparently without coordinating his movement with the northern campaign. Burgoyne was alone. The days between the two battles were days of slow, grinding deterioration for the British Army. Rations were running short. The baggage train that had struggled through nearly 200 miles of wilderness track had consumed enormous quantities of supplies simply getting this far. The cavalry horses, without adequate fodder, were weakening. The German troops, the Brunswick and Hesse-Hanau auxiliaries who made up a significant portion of Burgoyne's strength, were far from home, fighting in terrain they had never imagined, for a cause that was not theirs. In a war they had been contracted into by their sovereign princes. They were professional soldiers of considerable courage and discipline, but their morale was being ground down by the daily harassment of American Rangers, the constant attrition of patrol losses, and the growing awareness that the army they served was not advancing. The Pennsylvania long rifle spoke every day, not in massed volleys, but in the single, deliberate cracks of individual men who had found their positions in the trees and on the high ground before first light, and who spent the daylight hours making it dangerous to stand upright in the British camp. Sentries were shot at their posts. Foraging parties sent out to gather food from the surrounding farms returned, when they returned at all, with fewer men than they had left with. The steady daily drumbeat of those rifle shots was eating away at something deeper than just the numbers on a muster roll. It was eating away at the British Army's certainty. And then, on August 16th, before the main battles had even been fought, Burgoyne had experienced a disaster that should have told him everything he needed to know about the nature of the war he was fighting. Yet he had dispatched a force of roughly 700 regulars and German dragoons under Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum eastward toward Bennington, Vermont, to seize a large supply depot the Americans were reported to have there. Burgoyne needed horses, cattle, and grain. His army was beginning to starve. What Baum's men encountered at Bennington was Brigadier General John Stark and 1,500 New Hampshire militia, men who had, in many cases, walked from their farms and villages carrying whatever weapons they owned, motivated by something that no quartermaster's inventory could quantify and no European military theorist had ever managed to explain in a way that made tactical sense. Stark reportedly told his men before the battle began, in words that would be remembered for generations, "We beat them today, or Molly Stark sleeps a widow." The militia surrounded Baum's force on 3 sides. Baum was mortally wounded. Yet his command was shattered. When a relief column arrived, Stark's men, reinforced by additional militia who had arrived during the fighting, routed them as well. Of the roughly 700 men Burgoyne had sent to Bennington for supplies, over 2/3 were killed, wounded, or captured. He had sent for food and received instead the news that his army was more isolated and more endangered than even he had been willing to admit. The Battle of Bennington cost Burgoyne irreplaceable strength. Yet it demonstrated for the first time in the campaign that American militia, not just Continental regulars, not just professional soldiers who had trained alongside European officers, but ordinary citizens of the countryside who had simply decided they would not be ruled, could destroy a professional British force in open engagement. The news spread through the valley. More militia came. By the time Burgoyne summoned the courage for a second major engagement at the beginning of October, his army had dwindled from the 10,000 who had marched south from Canada to barely 6,000 effectives. The American force facing him had grown. Gates now commanded upward of 15,000 men, a force that included both hardened Continental regulars and the swelling numbers of militia who continued to arrive from every point of the compass. The ratio of forces had inverted entirely. On October 7, 1777, Burgoyne made one final attempt to break through. Yet he sent 1,500 men with 10 artillery pieces on what he described as a reconnaissance in force, a probing movement to test the American left flank and look for a weakness he could exploit. It was by that point an act of hope more than strategy. He had no other option. He could not retreat northward through forests his scouts no longer controlled. He could not wait indefinitely for a relief that was not coming. He had to advance or surrender. And the instincts of a lifetime refused to allow a man like John Burgoyne to surrender to a colonial rabble without trying, one last time, to break them. What happened in the subsequent hours would become one of the most dramatic military engagements of the entire Revolutionary War. Morgan's riflemen struck the British right immediately. The American left and center, under General Benjamin Lincoln, and in the famous confusion of command that defines that afternoon, under Benedict Arnold, who had been relieved of his command by a bitter quarrel with Gates and had no official authority whatsoever, crashed into the British line with an intensity that stunned the professional soldiers opposing them. Arnold, consumed by what witnesses described as an almost supernatural fury, rode across the entire front of the engagement without authority, without orders, rallying units on his own initiative, plunging into the gaps and crises of the battle wherever they appeared. Soldiers who saw him that day described him as a man transformed, reckless, burning, incandescent with something that those who had fought alongside him in the cold of Canada and the rivers of the North had been waiting to see again. The British right flank collapsed. The redoubts that had anchored Burgoyne's defensive position were carried by assault. General Simon Fraser, one of the finest and most experienced officers in the British Northern Army, a man whose steadiness had been the structural backbone of the entire campaign, was struck from his horse by a sharpshooter's bullet in the midst of attempting to rally his broken forces. The shot that struck Fraser came from a range of nearly 300 yards through heavy woodland in the smoke and confusion of an active engagement. Timothy Murphy, one of Daniel Morgan's riflemen, yet was credited with the shot by the accounts of those present. Fraser lingered until the following morning and died of his wound. His loss, at the moment it occurred, was catastrophic to British morale. Burgoyne himself reportedly wept when told. The Second Battle of Saratoga was over within hours. Burgoyne's force fell back to its camp above the river in disorder. He had lost another 600 men he could not replace. Arnold had taken a bullet through the leg in the final assault, and his horse shot beneath him, both the rider and the animal falling together into the mud of that October afternoon. He had been carried from the field, a hero whose name history would later complicate beyond recognition, but whose contribution to the day's events was, in the moment, absolute. Burgoyne retreated north to Saratoga and stopped. His army was surrounded. The Americans had moved behind him, cutting his line of retreat to Canada. There was no food. There was no hope of relief. It's that the same wilderness that had seemed, back in June, like merely the inconvenient opening terrain of a triumphal march, had become a prison without walls, a vast, pitiless enclosure of forest and river and cold October sky, from which there was no exit that did not lead through the American lines. For 10 days, Burgoyne negotiated. He attempted to secure terms that would allow his men to return to England in exchange for a pledge not to serve again in North America. He wrote letters to Gates. Yet he counted his remaining effectives, fewer than 5,000 by that point, many of them sick or wounded, against the 15,000 Americans encircling his position, and he sat with that arithmetic in the smoky silence of his headquarters and felt the full weight of what had happened to him. On October 17, 1777, the morning broke cold and clear over the Hudson Valley. A frost had settled in overnight, and the grasses along the riverbank were silver white in the early light. Yet the colors of the trees, the crimson and the amber, and the deep gold of the dying leaves, were vivid against the pale sky in a way that seemed almost indecent, almost theatrical, as though the American wilderness were arranging itself as a backdrop for what was about to happen. The British Army marched out of its entrenchments and down to the meadows along the Hudson River. They moved in formation, as they had always moved, scarlet and blue and gray, column after column, among the remnants of what had been one of the most powerful military expeditions ever dispatched from European shores to the North American continent. Less than 6,000 men, where 10,000 had begun. They reached the designated ground and halted, and one by one they laid their weapons in the grass. Muskets and bayonets and artillery pieces and the whole apparatus of imperial military power, set down in a New York meadow in the October cold. He surrendered to the army they had not believed would be there. General Burgoyne arrived on horseback, dressed in full uniform, conducting himself with the formal dignity that the occasion demanded and that his character required. He dismounted. He faced General Gates, who had come forward to receive the surrender in his own uniform of buff and blue. The two men stood for a moment in silence, the enormous weight of the occasion settling around them. Then Burgoyne raised his hat. And he spoke the words that would be remembered as long as the English language endured, as long as the story of this republic was told and retold across the generations. The fortune of war, General Gates, has made me your prisoner. Gates removed his own hat in response and replied, yet in the manner of an officer who understood the gravity of what was being acknowledged, I shall always be ready to bear testimony that it has not been through any fault of your excellency. The ceremony continued. 6,000 soldiers of the British Crown and their German auxiliaries stacked their weapons and marched into captivity. The cannon were surrendered. The regimental colors, those silk banners that represented the identity and honor of each British regiment, as the standards around which soldiers rallied in the smoke of battle, were surrendered. The flags of the greatest empire on earth had been lowered to a colonial militia. There was no gloating from the American side. Gates had ordered his men to remain silent and respectful as the British filed past. No jeering, no mockery, no celebration of the kind that might humiliate men who were conducting themselves with honor in defeat. Yet the American soldiers stood at attention in their rough clothes, some in uniform, many not, dressed in the homespun and leather of the farm and the forest, and they watched the parade of scarlet coats in silence. One German officer, writing home later, described this restraint as something that surprised him deeply. He had expected savagery from men the British had dismissed as barbarians. What he witnessed instead was something that confused him considerably more: discipline, dignity, yet the self-possession of men who did not need to humiliate their enemy because they were entirely certain of what they had accomplished. The news began moving. Riders took the road south. The dispatch that carried word of the British surrender at Saratoga traveled with the speed of horsemen through the autumn countryside, through the towns and villages of the 13 colonies, and then across the Atlantic on the fastest available ship. It arrived in London on December 2nd, 1777. So the city received it with shock, not the shallow surprise of unexpected tactical reversal, but the deep, systemic shock of a civilization encountering information that does not fit within its existing model of the world. Lord North, the Prime Minister, was reportedly devastated. King George III read the dispatches in the silence of his study and began to understand, perhaps for the first time, that this was not a provincial irritation that would resolve itself when sufficient force was applied. Something more fundamental was at stake, something the established mechanisms of empire were not designed to handle. The news arrived in Paris shortly after. Benjamin Franklin was already there, had been there for almost a year, patiently cultivating the court of Louis XVI with the exquisitely calibrated diplomacy of a man who understood that European powers did not enter foreign wars from sentiment or ideology alone. They entered them when they believed they could win. That Franklin had been arguing, with all the authority of his enormous prestige and his undeniable personal genius, that the American cause was viable, that these colonists, these farmers and tradesmen and frontier riflemen could actually defeat the most powerful military force on earth. The French had listened with interest and provided covert support, arms, ammunition, money funneled through fictitious trading companies, but they had not committed. Saratoga changed that calculation in a single morning. Within days of the news reaching the French court, King Louis XVI authorized his foreign minister to begin formal treaty negotiations with the American commissioners. The French saw what they needed to see: proof, undeniable and documented, that the British Army, that instrument of global domination they had watched defeat them on every continent for 2 decades, could be beaten in the field by American forces. If that was true, and then an alliance with those forces was not a romantic gesture toward an embattled people. It was a strategic investment in a winnable war. On February 6, 1778, less than 4 months after the cannon fell silent at Saratoga, France and the United States of America signed the Treaty of Amity and Commerce and the Treaty of Alliance in Paris. It was the first formal alliance the new nation would ever make. Yet it would bring French naval power to bear against the British in waters from the Caribbean to the English Channel. It would bring French money and men and artillery to the American cause. It would transform the American Revolution from a colonial insurrection into a world war. And that transformation would, in the fullness of time, make British victory effectively impossible. The Pennsylvania long rifle had done more than kill British officers in the woods above the Hudson River. Yet it had ended the age of unchallenged European military supremacy in the Americas. It had made an argument, in the only language that kings and foreign ministers ultimately understand, that the experiment called America was not a temporary disorder. It was a permanent fact. Consider the object itself for a moment. The Pennsylvania long rifle. It was not a weapon forged in any royal arsenal or manufactured under government contract to specified military dimensions. And it was made by individual craftsmen, gunsmiths in the German-settled communities of Pennsylvania, men of the Rhineland tradition who had brought their tools and their knowledge to the New World and adapted their trade to the materials and the distances of the American backcountry. Each rifle was slightly different from every other. Longer barrel, shorter barrel, different caliber, just different style of woodwork, each one the expression of a specific craftsman's judgment and a specific owner's preference. The very opposite of standardization. The very opposite of the industrial uniformity that the Brown Bess represented. When a British officer, trained at Sandhurst's predecessor academies in the geometry of massed volley tactics, was schooled in the mathematical relationship between formation depth and rate of fire that had governed European warfare for a century, when that officer first confronted the Pennsylvania long rifle in the hands of a man who had grown up in the Shenandoah Valley or the Virginia Piedmont, he was encountering more than a superior weapon. He was encountering a different philosophy of what a man is and what a man can do. The Brown Bess said, "The individual soldier does not matter, but the formation matters." The Pennsylvania rifle said, "The individual matters more than anything." It was a political statement, held by men who had volunteered their own lives for their own reasons, fighting on their own ground for principles they had articulated in their own language. The Pennsylvania long rifle was the physical embodiment of the idea that would become the American Republic. It reached across 300 yards and touched the center of history. After the surrender, and as the British columns marched into captivity and the German soldiers laid down their weapons and walked into the strange, bewildering experience of being prisoners of an army that refused to treat them as enemies, something remarkable was reported by multiple observers. The ordinary British and German soldiers encountered the ordinary American militia, and the two groups looked at each other with genuine curiosity. Lieutenant Thomas Anbury, a British officer who wrote extensively of his captivity following Saratoga, described American soldiers who did not conform at all to the image of crude colonial malcontents that had been the prevailing British stereotype. He encountered farmers who had read Locke. He encountered craftsmen who could articulate the philosophical basis of their rebellion with precision and feeling. He encountered men who were, by any measure, the equals of the men who had come to govern them, and who had no intention, now or ever, of accepting anything less. The defeated British soldiers were marched through the countryside on their way to imprisonment. They passed through American towns and villages, and the people came out to watch them go. What struck multiple British and German observers in their subsequent accounts was not the hostility of the civilian population, the jeering and the contempt they had expected and perhaps felt they deserved. What struck them was the abundance. The farms they passed were prosperous, the houses were substantial, the markets and warehouses of the towns were full. These were not the impoverished wretches of a subject people barely holding themselves above subsistence. Oh, these were people who had built something, stone walls and orchards and sawmills and tanneries, and who had decided, with the absolute conviction of people who have made something with their own hands, that no distant king had any claim upon it. General Burgoyne himself, observing the country through which he was conducted as a prisoner, would later remark upon the error of the fundamental British assumption about the colonists. He had come to America expecting to find a population that, as at its core, wished to be governed, that needed the framework of empire as much as empire needed their compliance. What he found instead, in the faces of the people who watched his shattered army pass through their countryside, was something that no military training had equipped him to understand. A people who had decided, collectively and irrevocably, that they were their own governors. That decision had been made before the battle. It had been growing in the colonies for years, and in the town halls and the pamphlets and the long arguments that had filled the spaces of American political life since the Stamp Act, and the Townshend duties, and the night of February 5, 1775, when the muskets first fired at Lexington and Concord. But it required demonstration. It required proof, not merely rhetorical proof, not merely the proof of a well-argued pamphlet, but the proof of a body of free men standing on a fortified height above a river and refusing, yet with their lives and their Pennsylvania long rifles, to move. The British Army had served involuntarily as the instrument by which that proof was made. Back in London, the postmortems began almost immediately. Parliamentary debate was fierce. Opposition politicians, among them the great Edmund Burke, who had argued consistently for a negotiated settlement with the colonies, pointed to Saratoga as the inevitable consequence of a policy built on contempt. Yet he had warned for years that the colonists were Englishmen, with all the legal instincts and constitutional convictions of Englishmen, and that no army would succeed in governing men who had decided they would not be governed. Saratoga seemed to confirm everything he had argued. Burgoyne returned to England and faced a parliamentary inquiry, and he had expected to be made the scapegoat for a campaign whose failure was partly his own, and partly the fault of strategic decisions made in London, and decisions not made by General Howe. He defended himself with considerable skill, and did not shy from attributing some blame to the wider failures of British strategic planning. He survived the inquiry, but his military career was effectively over. He wrote plays again in the comfortable obscurity of London theatrical life, and he did not return to America. But the deeper inquiry, the one that took place not in parliamentary committee rooms but in the minds of British military men, in the strategic discussions of admirals and generals and ministers across the following months and years, that inquiry produced conclusions that could not be published and could barely be spoken aloud. The British Army that had encountered something in America that its entire institutional framework had no category for, a population that fought not for pay, not for professional honor, not for dynastic loyalty, not for fear of punishment or court-martial, but for an idea. And an idea, as every soldier who had stood on a contested hillside above the Hudson River now understood at some level of the bones, was harder to defeat than any army. By the summer of 1778, the war had changed irrevocably. France had entered formally. Spain would follow. The Dutch would follow after that. What had been a colonial insurrection became a global conflict, and Britain found herself fighting on every ocean simultaneously. The strategic resources required to suppress the American rebellion had to be diverted to protect Caribbean sugar islands, to contest the Mediterranean, to defend the home islands themselves. The weight of the world had shifted, and it had shifted on October 17, 1777, out in a meadow by the Hudson River, when a man in a gold-laced uniform raised his hat to a man in a buff coat and spoke the words that named the pivot point of history. "The fortune of war, General Gates, has made me your prisoner." But it was not fortune, not in the way Burgoyne meant the word. It was not the blind luck of random event, the indifferent throw of circumstance that catches great men in its net without design. Yet it was something that had been building for years. In the silence of the frontier, in the steadiness of men who learned from childhood that survival required not orders from above, but judgment from within. It had been building in the long hours a farmer spent teaching his son to read by firelight, in the town meeting where a shoemaker stood up to debate a merchant about the nature of representation, and in the church where a pastor preached about the moral dignity of the individual before God and law. It had been building every time a man with a Pennsylvania rifle stood alone in the early morning of the American wilderness and decided with perfect clarity what he was aiming at and why. That rifle is still there if you know where to look. It not in any museum case, though some examples survive in glass and archival silence in the great collections of the nation, but in the idea the object represents. In the principle that a free individual, armed with knowledge and conviction and the tools appropriate to his environment, is worth more than a formation of compelled professionals. In the truth, tested and documented in the wooded hills above a New York river in the autumn of 1777, that the most powerful army on earth can be defeated by men who simply refuse to be governed by fear. The leaves were falling as the British Army marched into captivity. The frost was on the ground, and the sky was the hard, high blue of North American October, and the river moved south through the hills as it had always moved and would always move, indifferent to the great events conducted on its banks. Yet the men who stood watching the red columns file past, the farmers and riflemen and continental soldiers in their worn coats, men who had left their harvests and their workshops and their families and walked to the sound of the drums, those men did not know yet that they had changed the world. They knew only what they had done. They had stood their ground, and that, in the end, is what all the rest of it means. That not the treaties and the parliamentary debates and the French naval squadrons and the cartographers revising their maps of empire. Those are the consequences. The thing itself, the irreducible, foundational fact from which every consequence flows, is simpler than all of that. It is the image of men who believed they were worth defending, who looked at the most powerful military force their civilization had ever assembled and said, that with their bodies and their long rifles and their absolute refusal to retreat, not this ground, not this day, not these lives. Freedom is not given. It is not negotiated from strength. It does not arrive in the proclamations of distant kings or in the learned arguments of parliamentary committees. It arrives the way it arrived at Saratoga, in the cold morning, in the smoke of the first shot, in the long and grinding determination of ordinary people who have decided, quietly, completely, but with no theatrical flourish and no expectation of monuments, that they will not be owned. The world's greatest army found that out in the autumn of 1777, and the world has not been the same since.